So I recently did a talk piece in which, I vaguely, made a kind of comparison, not in a uh, precisely Wolfkin like way, but I compared a painting of Francis Bacon's called Painting with an exhibition by one of my former teachers, Fred Lonader, that had to do with the history of organized labor within the community that he works with, and the presentation of information in the actions that he participated in this kind of small but very tidy gallery space. And in that kind of comparison, I talked about the way that my work evolved from a certain way of representing, and you could say the traumas and violence of industry. The graphic effect of that pursuit of wealth and industrial power, the devastation upon both the environment and the human body. And I talked about a painting that I had done for Fred Lonader's class that was very much Bacon-like, and I talked about the criticism of his piece and how although I was initially, hurt by the fact that the piece didn't receive, the response that I wanted, I recognized in the criticism the logic of it and the why of it. And specifically, that representation, when it's always a looking back at a past moment, fails to really define itself as it otherwise would be able to, as a performativity in the present. That is, as an act of intervention or an act of direct address, a challenge, right? So I realized that my strategies of art making would have to change, and then with the ongoing devastation of our environment in the sequoias, I thought about Ansel Adams and the beautiful pictures of the sequoias that he had produced over so many years, and I thought about my own experience of the sequoias and the distinction, not only between the fact that these beautiful modernist photographs were in black and white, and my experience of the sequoia redwoods and the smells, that permeate one's being around these massive living entities, and the feeling of them, like you can almost feel the vibration between the trees. The roots are intertangled and connected in ways that that not only allow them to gather water and other resources from one another, but stabilize their relationship to the earth in this kind of a network of self, interlocking support, and how that idea of community, is there in the very evolution and genetic framework of these entities, and you can feel it. You really can. I mean, I know that sounds mystical, but I am mystical, and I don't think I'm the only one that has experienced this, but there's a very powerful sense of life here. And you know, so growing up, you know, with these trees, you know, my grandparents, you know, when you used to be able to own property in some of the areas of Sequoia, for example, a little village called Wilsonia, my grandparents owned a cabin there. And, you know, I've talked before about how I spent a lot of time growing up in the presence of these sequoias and you know, and ferns and pine and and the blue jays and bumblebees and the amazing variety of butterflies, and you would always see pheasants. There were, you know, pikas and deer, and in the early 70s there were still black bear in the sequoias, but you know, we would see, you know, less and less black bear, and by the 80s I don't think that there were black bear anymore. If they were, you know, so extremely shy. And I don't, you know, fish anymore, but I remember when I was a child, I fished, and I fished with my grandfather, and we used to fish at Three Rivers. There was a really great, you know, spot for trout fishing. And then later, when my wife Lori and I would go backpacking, we'd often go to the sequoias, and we'd go up above tree line to, you know, places like Moose Lake, and Moose Lake had you know, natural brook trout, so you could actually live there in the rocks and fish for brook trout, you know, and that would sustain you, and you could live there for, you know, weeks, I imagine even, you know, months, just on the trout that was available. And of course, you know, ecosystems are chains of life. So the loss of the important elements of the chain, like the redwoods, affects everything else. So if there were once deer, the likelihood of their continued existence, you know, becomes, you know, increasingly threatened with the loss of the important links in the chain, bear, all of the elements of life in our life. And but growing up in the early 70s, you know, we were always aware of the threat of our destruction, the toxic effect of our continued use of certain kinds of you know, natural resources, the effect of the environment upon these, you know, toxic emissions, carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide on life and on our health, and you know, African American communities are you know, profoundly aware of these conditions as well, you know, because so many children in the city suffer from asthma. I was an asthma sufferer when I was a child as well, and I know the devastating effects that has upon human health as well. And I grew out of mine, but not everyone does. I've had friends who continue, you know, in adulthood to suffer from the effects of all of this. And we were aware of it. You know, we were certainly aware of it, and there was a moment, you know, in which a day was designated, a day that we call Earth Day, that was a designation of our understanding of the toll that we were taking, and for some of us, a commitment to make changes. And I remember in one of my special education classes when I was in grammar school, we were always doing projects, and many of these projects had to do with Earth. We built communities, imaginary communities, and we had to learn about the geography and what industry we could have there, and how it would sustain, both a viable economy in which human beings could prosper, and how it would continue to maintain itself as an ecospace in the environment. And I remember we built a solar oven, and I remember that we built a filtration system for decontaminating water, and I remember, so we had to make bad water, so we got different kinds of things to put in the water, and then we had to filter it out, and then just as a last resort, just in case, we boiled the water at the end. But all of these things worked, right? And this was back in the early 70s, between 1970 and 1974, and the technology, for solar power and for all of these technologies has only grown. It's only grown, and we're completely capable technologically of sustaining our world, and yet we refuse to. And why is that? And I have always been extremely critical of the industries that fail us, and the ironies of the ways in which they fail us. And I'll give one example of the ironies of the ways they fail us, but it's ubiquitous, right? And it's frustrating, maddeningly frustrating to even talk about it. But when after my mother died, and I had a lot of res dogs, because I was rescuing res dogs, and she had been living in the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I had moved all these dogs into her place in Santa Fe, and I got in trouble because you weren't allowed to have that many dogs, and then the city said they were problematic dogs because of what they were, formerly feral dogs, even though they were really sweet. But anyway, I lost my homeowner's insurance, and we had to move, and I found this place in California, in a town called Julian, right? So moved there, and one of the first things that I did was I installed solar on the property, and that cost me about $20,000. But at that time, I had the money, and that's what I wanted to do, and I knew that it was the right thing to do, and was willing to make that commitment. Now, this place that I'm talking about in Julian, California, was about a 10-acre property with a paved but very windy switchback road going up that in the winter was largely inaccessible because of the snow. The elevation wasn't that high. It was about 5,000 feet, and the climb was at least somewhere between 500 to 1,000 feet, up the switchback road. And in the wintertime, I largely kept the place warm by burning oak. There had been a fire a few years back, and a lot of the oak had been damaged and fell in that fire. And I never had to cut any wood down. I used the wood on the property that was already fallen, and there was so much of it that even when I eventually sold the property, there was an excess of oak and other fallen wood that could be used for to heat the place. But when I purchased the property, it was already on the grid, so it had electrical access, and the electrical grid is is something like these sequoias, right? Everyone is connected to everyone else, and So like these sequoias that draw water from, and nutrients from the soil from various locations, each location has a slightly different source, right? And the energy source for these sequoias are the nutrients in the soil itself, the water in the ground, the sunlight, that reaches the leaves of the trees, and different, and other, factors as well. And so being on the grid, has, both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that one doesn't require, for example, batteries, solar batteries. And the technology for solar batteries, still needs to be developed more. And the reason is not because of storage capacity, but because of environmental harm. The top of the line solar batteries are still made from lithium. And if you don't know this, lithium is a poison, right? So that's why, Kurt Cobain is no longer with us, because he was diagnosed with a mental illness and then he was prescribed a poison. And if you have a cell phone and it has a lithium battery, and something goes wrong with the casing of that battery, you'll feel the heat from the cell phone. It feels like, well, very much like other types of battery. If you remember, I don't know if you had ever done this as a child, put your tongue on the tip of a battery, and it has a very acidy kind of feel to it, right? That tingles. And these lithium batteries produce heat, and they're basically toxic, and you can't recycle the materials when you're done with them. So when my wife and I put in the solar panels for this property, you have two options. You can be on the grid or off the grid. Well, we were already on the grid, and in addition to the fact that these batteries are harmful to the environment, we, like these trees, wanted to share our energy. So we put enough solar panel on the property to generate about twice as much energy as we intended on using, and that's what they did. They produced about twice as much. So in addition to providing, solar power for our property, we were returning the same amount of solar power to the grid, and someone else could use this clean energy as well. And so the batteries were one of the obstacles for going off the grid. The other was that the power company in that area, which is run by San Diego Gas and Electric, SDG&E, already had rights to an easement on our property, so that they had rights to get up on our property. And you have to go through a lot of rigmarole to change easement rights, and if you're already on grid, it's difficult to get off grid. But there didn't seem to be any rationale for doing it until much later. But that's what I want to talk about. That's why I want to talk about the irony of capitalism's interventions in our attempts to save our planet. So this is a high fire area. You can't even get fire insurance there, right? The only non-government agency organization that you could actually get, and they don't do it anymore, that you could actually get fire insurance from, was State Farm. And it turned out that there were all kinds of problems with State Farm that I won't get into here, but I'll get into certainly, at some other time. But just leave it there for now, other than saying that I certainly would never have a relationship with State Farm again. But But because of the pending threat of fires in this area, San Diego Gas and Electric (SDG&E) is always sending out these warnings and always shutting off power at certain times of the year, and if it's windy you don't have power, and if different kinds of things going on. And the reason isn't because they don't want fires. The reason is because they were sued, because these power companies cause more fires in the state of California than anything else, than lightning strikes, than human carelessness, than anything else. It's these fallen power lines that generate these fires. And then at some point they started to be held accountable, and at that point is when all of these fire safety protocols and procedures were implemented, and they even they send out texts and make phone calls when they're going to shut off the power, and then they have a lot of justifications around their actions that involve fire safety events and things like that. But the truth is, and this will be revealed in my anecdote, that they're the cause, in large part, of all of these fires, in more than one way. Okay, so we opt to stay on the grid and share, like these sequoias share our resources with our community, right? Which isn't a lot, but it's another unit of what we're utilizing of our solar production on our panels. Okay, so when you do that and you stay on grid, you have a contract with SDG&E. Well, SDG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, kept changing the terms of its contract and modifying the way that it would charge for power. And the effect of this was economically pretty devastating. So in spite of the fact that we were producing twice as much power overall as we were using, because SDG&E wanted, first of all, just to even have the contract to be on the grid, you get charged, right? So it'd be like if these, like I decided, okay, I want to be a redwood and I want to be connected to all these redwoods. Well, there's a fee. There's a redwood association fee, and so SDG&E would charge you whatever it was, $10, $50 a month for being on the grid, even though you're really returning power to the grid. So they're making money on your power, and then they're making money on your contract for them to use your power, right? All right, and then in addition to that, the changes in their policy were tiered rates of energy use. So, for example, during the day, right, when I'm producing all of this, our property is producing all of this solar energy, right? That's considered like a low use or whatever period, and the rate is relatively low. Oh, I forgot to tell you this too. They pay you 2 cents on the dollar back what you overproduce as energy, right? So it's not that you're giving it to them for free, but if you had a month where you didn't have solar power, say your solar power went out, they would charge you, say like for 1 unit. Let's just use $100 because it's easy to do the percentages on. They would charge you $100 for that 1 unit of energy. I'm just making this up, but the proportions are equal. But if you overproduced the next month, right, and you gave to them the same amount of energy that you used, that you paid $100 for, they would give you $2 back, so that you get 2 cents on every dollar that they charge you for, right? So the the disproportionality is not an incentive to put in $20,000 worth of solar, right? So almost none of my neighbors had solar, because because the economy is part of the way they think, and it wasn't profitable or beneficial to them to do it, right? And then the other thing is, okay, so the tiered rates involve this. So when you're producing all of this electricity, right, and if you don't have any place to store it, and it's not in a battery, right, their idea was that, okay, well, you're producing it at this low cost time, but then if you use it at night and you're not producing it, then you're using our energy. So you may have like overproduced during the day, but then they're going to charge you at night for the energy that they're selling you back of your own power. Your own power, right? They're selling you back your own power at a rate that exceeds what they were willing to pay you for it by like 50 times. All right. Okay. So the motivation then in all of this, and often misrepresenting like the amount of energy use that you actually incurred, like if you compare your bill to what your meter says, right? Okay, so all of that, and then and you can't argue with them. I mean, I tried calling them and saying, look, this is what the contract says, this is how come you're charging me all of this? And you just they tell you then that your contract doesn't have to do with the amount of power. It has to do with whatever the new regulations in their billing system are, and it's almost impossible to have a conversation with them. So the motivation for installing and sharing, which should just be like something that we're all committed to, right? Because we love the redwoods, because it's good to share, because we care, right? It's just not there. It's like they've done almost everything that they possibly can, like to mitigate the rationale for installing solar, and then they tell us that they have this big concern about fire safety, when in fact it's the production of non-solar, non-sustaining energy systems that has created the crisis of climate change that is the main contributor, other than fallen electrical power lines, right, to the devastation of these forests and to the devastation of our world in other ways as well, right? So that irony, that's just one personal example of why it's so frustrating to watch this. And now, and I do appreciate all of the concern that many people have, regarding the destruction of these forests. But it makes me wonder, because everyone also loved looking at those Ansel Adams, but it wasn't enough, right? It wasn't enough for anyone to say, oh, we really need to do something to save those trees that look so great in our Ansel Adams books, or that look so great, in the galleries and the museums, because we really care. We cared, we loved it, it was beautiful, but it wasn't enough to act, was it? So bringing it back to the discussion that I had the other day regarding painting, and regarding Fred Launerter's work, I just hope that we're not experiencing this moment of painting, meaning that it's this moment of regret and loss, right? But it hurts us, and it may even cause us to cry, for these living entities whose lifespans have exceeded generations of our own. But But is it even that experience of loss? Is it enough? Is it enough to change? Because for those of us who have been displacements, I've talked about displacements, right? This work that I began in the early '80s, and in displacements there was a station, there was a Sequoia station, okay, and at that station, in addition to being a little representation of a community barbecue that my fellow artists, had the opportunity to, participate with, and a lot of them ate, hot dogs and on hot dog buns and fed themselves. But the representation was of ecological issues, and the tape running on that particular piece, was my representation of the questions that a young man who was multiply disabled asked me about a time in California that was undergoing a similar event. And the questions were, are there fires in the mountains? Are the fires being put out? Why are there fires in the mountains? Are the mount? And this was an individual who, as a character, I named Denny, but whose reality, grew, who I met, and the reality of the representation was that it grew out of an experience that I had with a real person, and the representations of these stations of displacements. They were representations, but they grew out of these experiences that I had with real events in real time with real people. And the character of Denny, in this representation was, based on my experience with this actual individual. And he was concerned with these fires, and he asked questions about them, and I tried to answer those questions, and I tried to bring, my concern regarding those fires and regarding his concern of those fires into the piece, and it's material that I've been working with for a long time, and as the decades go on, and as I continue to experience, stuff like what goes on with San Diego Gas and Electric, it does become more and more frustrating and more difficult to maintain hope. So when you see someone, a young person like Greta Thunberg, and the fierceness with which she addresses these issues, you feel totally like inspired and protective of her, right? Like the way that, these giant sequoias protect their environment. And you hope, that someone will finally get it, and change the big picture and put it in like a perspective where the information and what actually, constitutes the harm that we're doing, and the rationale that's really behind all of the harm isn't just hidden with, these the propaganda that places like SDG&E produce when they tell you about fire safety, but they're really the main contributors to the damage. I will just end, with some snapshots and discussion of my relationship to some of these places. This is a little ways from the cabin that my grandparents owned. That's me. I don't know how old I am here. This might be third grade, so what would that be like? I don't know, 73 maybe. You can see the poor stump here. It was probably removed for the road. So, we've never been, terrifically, kind to our fellow beings here on planet Earth. And, maybe not, as terribly unkind, but I'm using it as a kind of pedestal. I guess I'm performing the function of a statue or something, and or just, maybe I'm imitating the redwoods themselves, making myself taller and like them. This reminds me of Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree in a way, but it's probably my mother, who is no longer with us, that took the picture. And here's one of her. I took this one. This is a different location. I'm not sure where this is. This, they used to have a walk around this stump. It was called a big stump, like Bigfoot, only a stump. And this stump was, what remained after loggers had taken one of these, really significantly large sequoias in the late 1800s, and what was left, was this stump that, the carpenter ants turned into sawdust and used for, to build these massive communities. So it still had some use, for them. But, again, marking, the fact that these, that our use of this space had never been, particularly kind. But there were walks around that stump, and it was a beautiful walk, and a ranger would take you around and talk about it. This may have been taken at that walk. It looks like it. I can see that there's a stone creek bed in the background, and these beautiful flowers in the foreground. It's interesting because I often do this as a photographer and a filmmaker, where I put something very small in the foreground, and then I look through it, and I'm looking at this photograph and thinking, this is many years ago. This is how many years ago is this? 50 years ago, and I was already, doing it then. It's kind of interesting. This is an image of my grandfather in front of an outdoor barbecue, made out of brick, that we used to cook brook trout and other trout. There's a larger lake there that has stocked fish, and you can get rainbow trout. I always prefer the brook trout, but I don't eat that stuff anymore. I'm a vegetarian, but at the time it was wonderful. This is their what was their property. It's probably still their property. I think my uncle still owns this, if it still exists at this point. I'm not certain. And this is another later image. That's my grandfather. And I'm on the very left. That's my friend Scott from high school. Or this might have been junior high. I think this was still junior high. And he went on to become an engineer and study math and engineering at MIT. He was already extraordinary at programming back in 1976, 1977, I think. I may be wrong about that. He might have started doing that work a little bit later. That's my grandmother and my mother in front of some meadow flower bed, another fallen tree. My grandmother was always very uncomfortable in pictures, but tried to pretend like she wasn't. So my mother, I think she's standing on the same stump, or maybe she's not standing on it. She's standing near it. Not a particularly good photograph. This one. And my mother again. I'm assuming that I must have taken most of these. My mother and my grandmother. This is not their property. I think my mother wanted me to take this picture at someone else's property because I think she really liked this property. This would have been the property if she had had the resources that she would have wanted to purchase. You can see there's some interest in it. You know what I mean? Really nicely kind of integrated into the environment, but kind of a friendly open space. And this will be the last one. This is another, and that looks like a fairly recent cut, so I'm not sure why that. I think this would have been, this isn't protected forest, and there was logging, it's more like national forest as opposed to national park. But no, I could think, I'm not sure where this would have been. So I'm not sure if this is national forest or national park and why that tree had been cut. But you can see that, even back then, it didn't end in the 1800s. And they're still doing logging. I'm not sure if this is an Ansel Adams. I don't think so because it's color, but other than the color, it looks somewhat like some of the Ansel Adams.